Welcome to Biblical Curiosities. Today, we journey deep into the heart of a man whose life was a battlefield of ambition and faith. We explore the raw, unfiltered story of Jacob, a man who wrestled not only with his brother, but with God himself, to be transformed from a deceiver into a prince. This is the story of how our deepest flaws can become the stage for God's greatest miracles. Subscribe, activate the bell, and walk with us to the end. It is very important for the growth of the channel. In the vast, sun-scorched landscapes of the ancient Near East, where life was dictated by the seasons, the flock, and the promises of God, a profound drama was unfolding within the very tent of Isaac and Rebekah. For years, their home had been marked by a silent sorrow, a deep longing that every prayer echoed, the cry for a child. Rebekah was barren, and in a culture where a woman's worth was so deeply intertwined with her ability to bear sons and continue a lineage, this was a heavy burden to carry. Isaac, a man who had himself been a miracle child, pleaded with the Lord for his wife. He interceded with the passion of a man who understood God's power to create life from emptiness, and God, in his infinite mercy and perfect timing, heard his cry. Rebekah conceived, but this was no ordinary pregnancy. The joy of a coming child was soon overshadowed by a violent, relentless struggle within her. It was a war in her womb, so fierce and confusing that it drove her to a point of despair. She cried out to the Lord, "If all is well, why am I like this?" It was a question born of pain and confusion, a plea for understanding, and God answered her not with a simple comfort, but with a prophecy that would shape the destiny of nations. He spoke to her, revealing a truth that defied all cultural norms and expectations. "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." This divine declaration set the stage for a lifetime of conflict. In the world where the firstborn son received everything, the double portion of the inheritance, the patriarchal authority, and the spiritual leadership of the family, God had just turned the entire system upside down. The divine favor was to rest upon the younger. When the time came, the first child emerged, red and covered in hair like a garment. They named him Esau. As he was born, the second son came out, his tiny hand grasping Esau's heel. This act was so symbolic that they named him Jacob, which means he who grasps the heel, a name that would foreshadow his entire life's journey as a supplanter, a schemer, a man who would constantly try to get ahead by his own strength and cunning. The two boys grew, and their differences were as stark as day and night. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, rugged, impulsive, and beloved by his father Isaac for the savory game he brought home. Jacob, in contrast, was a quiet man, preferring to stay among the tents, a contemplative and strategic soul who was the favorite of his mother, Rebekah. This division of affection within the family created a fracture, a subtle but dangerous fault line that would eventually erupt into an earthquake of betrayal and sorrow, all stemming from that prophetic word spoken to a desperate mother. The younger would be the one to carry the covenant promise, the sacred lineage that would one day lead to the Messiah. This was not just a family drama, it was a cosmic one, where God's sovereign plan was being woven through the flawed, beautiful, and broken threads of human hearts. The prophecy hung in the air of Isaac's household for years, a silent tension that shaped the two young men. Esau, the firstborn, lived entirely in the present moment. He was a man of immense physical appetite, driven by the immediate gratification of his senses, the thrill of the hunt, the taste of fresh meat, the freedom of the wild. He was not a man given to deep thought or spiritual contemplation. The birthright to him was an abstract concept, a future promise that held little value compared to the gnawing hunger in his belly on any given day. Jacob, on the other hand, understood its weight. He had likely heard his mother, Rebekah, whisper the story of the prophecy to him countless times. He knew he was destined for greatness, but his vision was clouded by his own ambition. He saw the promise of God not as a gift to be received with grace, but as a prize to be seized by strategy. His desire for the birthright was not necessarily rooted in pure spiritual devotion, but in a hunger for prominence and control. This simmering conflict came to a head on a day that seemed ordinary. Jacob was at home, a place he was most comfortable, and had prepared a pot of red lentil stew. The aroma would have been rich and earthy, a comforting scent filling the tent. At that very moment, Esau returned from the hunt, exhausted and famished. He was physically depleted, his judgment clouded by his overwhelming physical need. "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm about to die," he exclaimed, his words dripping with hyperbole but revealing his character. He saw the stew, and in that moment, it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Jacob saw his opportunity. This was the moment his calculating mind had been waiting for. He didn't offer the stew out of brotherly compassion. Instead, he presented a cold, hard transaction. "First, sell me your birthright," he demanded. The contrast is staggering. One brother offers something of eternal spiritual value, while the other craves a temporary physical satisfaction. Esau's response is one of the most tragic and telling moments in Scripture. He scoffed, "Look, I am about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" He despised his inheritance. He treated the sacred blessing of the firstborn, the spiritual leadership of the family, and his place in God's covenant plan as something worthless, something to be traded away for a single meal. In his mind, the future was distant and uncertain, but his hunger was real and immediate, so he made an oath. He swore away his destiny, his legacy, and his spiritual authority. Jacob, having secured the legal and verbal transfer of the birthright, then gave his brother bread and the lentil stew. Esau ate and drank, got up and left. The Bible records this moment with a chilling finality. So Esau despised his birthright. He walked away with a full stomach but an empty soul, having traded the eternal for the temporary. Jacob, on the other hand, now possessed the legal claim to the birthright, but he had obtained it through cunning and exploitation of his brother's weakness. He had won the battle, but the victory was hollow, tainted by the methods he used. This single event set a precedent for Jacob's life, a pattern of striving and scheming that God would have to spend decades untangling and redeeming. The deception had begun, and its consequences would ripple through their family for generations to come. Years passed, and the chasm between the brothers deepened. The stolen birthright was a wound that never truly healed, festering beneath the surface of their daily lives. Now, Isaac was an old man. His eyes were dim, so he could no longer see. He felt his time on earth was drawing to a close, and his thoughts turned to the final, sacred duty of a patriarch, to bestow the blessing. This was more than just a father's good wishes. It was a powerful prophetic pronouncement that was believed to be divinely inspired and irreversible. It would determine the destiny of his son and his descendants, shaping their prosperity, their influence, and their relationship with God. Despite knowing of the prophecy given to his wife, and despite Esau's reckless sale of the birthright, Isaac's heart still clung to his firstborn. He loved Esau, and he intended to give him the blessing. He called Esau to his side and said, "Go out to the open country and hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." It was a request rooted in love, but also in a stubborn disregard for the divine will that had already been revealed. Rebekah overheard this exchange. A cold dread must have filled her heart. She saw the sacred covenant promise, the one God himself had guaranteed for her favorite son, Jacob, about to be given away. Her faith in God's ability to fulfill his own promise wavered. and she decided to take matters into her own hands. She believed she was helping God, but in reality, she was orchestrating a deception that would tear her family apart forever. She devised a detailed and audacious plan. She called Jacob and instructed him, "Go and get 2 choice young goats, so I can prepare some tasty food for your father, just the way he likes it. Then take it to your father to eat, so that he may give you his blessing before he dies." Jacob hesitated, not out of moral conviction, but out of fear of being caught. "My brother Esau is a hairy man, and I have smooth skin," he argued. "What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him and would bring down a curse on myself instead of a blessing." His fear was of the consequences, not of the sin itself. But Rebekah was resolute. "Let the curse fall on me, my son," she declared. "Just do what I say." Her desperation had consumed her. She prepared the savory meal, and then she committed to the deception fully. She took Esau's best clothes, which would have carried his distinct outdoorsy scent, and put them on Jacob. She then covered his smooth hands and the back of his neck with the goatskins, a tactile illusion designed to fool a blind man's touch. It was a multi-sensory deception, targeting Isaac's sense of smell, touch, and taste. Jacob, now disguised as his brother, went into his father, his heart surely pounding in his chest. "My father," he said. Isaac, suspicious, asked, "Who is it, my son?" Jacob lied directly. "I am Esau, your firstborn." The lie was bold and absolute. Isaac was still uncertain. "How did you find the game so quickly?" he questioned. Jacob compounded his lie with blasphemy, invoking the name of God to cover his deceit. "The Lord your God gave me success." The tension in the room must have been suffocating. Isaac, still not convinced, demanded to touch him. As his frail hands felt the hairy goatskins, he was fooled. "The voice is the voice of Jacob," he murmured, "but the hands are the hands of Esau." Despite his lingering doubts, the familiar scent of his firstborn and the feel of the hairy skin persuaded him. He ate the meal, drank the wine, and then bestowed the blessing. He spoke words of power and destiny over Jacob, words of dew from heaven, richness of the earth, and dominion over nations. Just as Jacob left, Esau returned, carrying the food he had prepared. He entered his father's tent full of anticipation, only to be met with a horrifying truth. When Isaac realized he had been tricked, he trembled violently. The full weight of the irreversible act crashed down upon him, and when Esau heard his father's words, he burst out with a great and bitter cry, a sound of pure, shattered heartbreak. "Bless me too, my father," he pleaded. But it was too late. The blessing, once given, could not be retracted. The deception was complete, but the cost was immense. Jacob had secured the blessing, but he had lost his brother, his home, and his integrity. He was now a fugitive, forced to flee from the murderous rage of the brother he had so deeply wronged. Jacob's flight from Beersheba was not a journey of adventure. It was a desperate escape born of fear and guilt. He was running for his life. The bitter cry of his brother Esau and his vow of revenge, "The days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob," echoed in his ears with every step he took. He was utterly alone, stripped of his family, his home, and the sense of security he had always known. As he traveled toward the distant land of Haran, the sun began to set on his first day as an exile. The vast, empty wilderness surrounded him. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a physical manifestation of the desolation in his own soul. He had no tent, no companions, only the clothes on his back and the heavy burden of his deceit. He found a certain place to rest for the night, and in a simple yet profound act, he took one of the stones from that place, put it under his head, and lay down to sleep. He was at his absolute lowest point, a deceiver, a fugitive, a man who had seemingly outrun everyone, but could not outrun himself, or the God he had so flippantly invoked in his lies. It was here, in this place of total vulnerability and loneliness, that God chose to reveal himself. Jacob had not sought God. He had not prayed for a vision. But grace found him anyway. As he slept, he dreamed, and it was a dream of stunning cosmic significance. He saw a stairway, a magnificent ladder, resting on the earth, with its top reaching to the very heavens. This was not a flimsy, man-made ladder. It was a divine connection, a bridge between the earthly realm of his failure and the heavenly realm of God's glory. And on this stairway, the angels of God were ascending and descending. They were messengers of the divine, trafficking between heaven and earth, demonstrating that God was not a distant, uninterested deity, but was actively involved in the affairs of humanity, even in the life of a flawed man like Jacob. Then, in the dream, the Lord himself stood above it and spoke. God did not begin with condemnation or rebuke. He began with identity and promise. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. He was connecting Jacob back to the covenant, reminding him that he was part of a much larger story. Then God personally reiterated the covenant promises to Jacob. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And then came the words that must have pierced Jacob's frightened heart with unimaginable comfort and hope. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, the fear and loneliness were replaced by a profound sense of awe. He was trembling, not with fear of Esau, but with the fear of the Lord. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it, he exclaimed. He realized that God's presence was not confined to a holy tent or a family altar. It was present even in the desolate wilderness of his escape. He named the place Bethel, which means house of God. The stone he had used for a pillow, a symbol of his hardship, he now set up as a pillar and consecrated it with oil, turning a common object into a sacred memorial. He made a vow, a response to God's unconditional promise, pledging his allegiance and his tithes if God would indeed be with him and bring him back safely. This was Jacob's first true personal encounter with God. It was a turning point. He was still the flawed schemer, but now he knew he was a flawed schemer who was unconditionally loved and chosen by a faithful God. He left Bethel a different man, no longer just a fugitive running from his past, but a pilgrim walking toward a divinely promised future. Carrying the promise of Bethel in his heart, Jacob continued his long journey eastward to the land of his mother's people, Haran. After weeks of travel, he finally arrived near a well where shepherds were gathering their flocks. It was here that his life would take another dramatic turn. He inquired about his uncle, Laban, and as divine providence would have it, Laban's own daughter Rachel was approaching the well with her father's sheep. The moment Jacob saw Rachel, he was captivated. The Bible tells us she was lovely in form and beautiful. For Jacob, it was love at first sight, a deep and powerful emotion that would define the next 2 decades of his life. Moved by a strength born of this newfound love, he single-handedly rolled the great stone from the mouth of the well, a task that normally took several shepherds, and watered his uncle's flock. He then introduced himself, and in a rare display of raw emotion, he wept aloud and kissed his cousin. This was a man overwhelmed, finding a glimmer of home and hope after a long and lonely exile. Laban welcomed him with open arms, and Jacob began to work for his uncle. After a month, Laban, a shrewd and calculating man himself, proposed a wage for Jacob's labor. This was Jacob's moment. He had found something he desired more than any inheritance or blessing: Rachel. He made an offer. I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. 7 years was an exorbitant bride price, a testament to the depth of his love. Laban readily agreed, seeing an opportunity to secure a diligent worker for a long time. The Bible beautifully captures the next period of Jacob's life. So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. This was a man completely consumed by his love. He worked tirelessly, his eyes fixed on the prize of marrying the woman he adored. Finally, the 7 years were complete. Jacob went to Laban and said, "Give me my wife. My time is completed." Laban gathered the people of the place and gave a great wedding feast. The celebration would have been joyous, filled with music, food, and dancing, lasting late into the night. But under the cover of darkness and cultural tradition, where the bride would be heavily veiled, Laban orchestrated a deception that would mirror the one Jacob himself had perpetrated on his own father. He took his older daughter, Leah, not the beautiful Rachel, and brought her to Jacob's tent. The Bible describes Leah as having weak or delicate eyes, a stark contrast to Rachel's celebrated beauty. In his love-struck anticipation and in the darkness of the night, Jacob was tricked. He did not realize the switch until the morning light revealed the devastating truth. When he awoke, he was married not to the woman he loved, but to her sister. The shock, the betrayal, the bitter irony must have crashed down on him with crushing force. He, the great supplanter, the master of deceit, had been played. He confronted Laban, his voice filled with outrage. "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban's excuse was flimsy, a convenient cultural custom. "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." He then offered a cruel bargain. "Finish this daughter's bridal week. Then we will give you the younger one also, in return for another 7 years of work." Jacob was trapped. His love for Rachel was so strong that he had no choice but to agree. He completed Leah's bridal week and was then given Rachel as his wife as well, but at the cost of another 7 years of indentured servitude. He had finally married the woman of his dreams, but his life was now impossibly complicated. He was married to 2 sisters, one he loved and one he did not. The deceiver had been paid back in his own coin, a harsh but powerful lesson from God that the seeds of deception, no matter where they are sown, will always produce a bitter harvest. He was now living in the middle of the same kind of family dysfunction, rivalry, and pain that he himself had created back home. The subsequent years in Laban's household were a crucible for Jacob, a long and painful period of trial that would forge his character. He now had 2 wives, sisters who were locked in a heart-wrenching rivalry for his affection. Jacob's preference for Rachel was clear and undisguised. He loved Rachel, but he did not love Leah. This imbalance created a toxic environment of jealousy, competition, and sorrow that permeated their home. God, in his compassion, saw Leah's pain. The scripture says, "When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless." This act of divine mercy, however, only intensified the sisters' rivalry. For Leah, each child was a desperate attempt to win her husband's love. With the birth of her first son, Reuben, she declared, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." With her second, Simeon, she said, "Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too." With her third, Levi, her hope was even more palpable. "Now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons." And with her fourth, Judah, from whose line the Messiah would come, she finally shifted her focus, saying, "This time I will praise the Lord." She was slowly learning to find her worth in God rather than in her husband's fleeting affection. While Leah was building a family, Rachel's heart was breaking. Her barrenness was a source of deep shame and anguish. In her desperation, she lashed out at Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Her pain was so immense, it blinded her to the fact that Jacob could not control conception. The rivalry escalated to a new level when Rachel, following the custom of the time, gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob as a surrogate. Bilhah bore 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali, whom Rachel claimed as her own, seeing them as victories in her silent war against her sister. Not to be outdone, Leah, who had stopped having children, gave her servant Zilpah to Jacob, and she bore 2 more sons, Gad and Asher. The sons were no longer just children. They were pawns in a painful game of one-upmanship. The tension was constant, the home filled with the silent screams of 2 unhappy women vying for the love of one man. In the midst of this domestic turmoil, Jacob continued to serve his manipulative uncle Laban. For 20 years he toiled, tending Laban's flocks with diligence and skill. But Laban was a treacherous employer, changing Jacob's wages 10 times, constantly trying to cheat him out of his rightful earnings. Despite Laban's schemes, God blessed Jacob. The Lord was with him, just as he had promised at Bethel. Jacob proposed a deal to Laban regarding his wages. He would take all the speckled, spotted and dark-colored sheep and goats from the flock as his own. Laban, thinking these were the rarer animals, readily agreed, assuming he was getting the better end of the deal. But Jacob, using a combination of folk animal husbandry and, more importantly, receiving the blessing of God, saw his own flocks multiply at an astonishing rate. God was teaching Jacob a vital lesson. His prosperity did not depend on his own cunning or on the fairness of his human masters. His prosperity came directly from the hand of God. God was systematically dismantling Jacob's old self-reliance and teaching him to depend wholly on him. During these long, hard years, Jacob became the father of 11 sons and a daughter, Dinah. Finally, God blessed Rachel, and she conceived and gave birth to a son, Joseph. The birth of Joseph seemed to be a turning point, signaling to Jacob that his time of exile was nearing its end. He had been a servant for 2 decades, had endured a loveless marriage, a bitter family rivalry, and a deceitful boss. He had been humbled, disciplined, and matured. The arrogant young man who had fled Canaan was now a seasoned patriarch, the father of a great tribe. He had learned through bitter experience that God's plans are fulfilled not through human scheming, but through divine faithfulness, even in the midst of the most painful and messy circumstances of life. After 20 long years of labor and enduring Laban's constant deceit, a shift occurred. The blessing of God upon Jacob was so evident that it became a source of contention. Laban's sons grew resentful, whispering among themselves, "Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." The friendly facade Laban had once maintained began to crumble, and Jacob saw that his uncle's attitude toward him had changed. The atmosphere in Haran had become hostile and dangerous. It was at this critical juncture that God spoke to Jacob again, his voice cutting through the tension with a clear and definitive command. "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." This was the divine release Jacob had been waiting for, the fulfillment of the promise made at Bethel so many years before. The promise to bring him back home. Jacob knew a direct confrontation with Laban would be futile. His uncle would never willingly let go of his most valuable asset. So, drawing on his old instincts for strategy, but this time with a divine mandate, he planned a secret departure. He called his wives, Leah and Rachel, out to the fields, away from the prying ears of Laban's household. He laid out his case before them, recounting their father's treachery, how he had changed his wages 10 times and cheated him repeatedly. But he was quick to give credit where it was due. "But God has not allowed him to harm me." He told them of his dream, where the angel of God had affirmed that his prosperity was a direct result of divine intervention, a reward for his suffering under Laban. He concluded with the Lord's command to return to his native land. To their credit, Rachel and Leah stood united with their husband. They recognized the injustice of their father's actions, stating, "Do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us." They gave Jacob their full support, and with their blessing the plan was set in motion. Seizing an opportunity when Laban was away shearing his sheep, a time-consuming task that would keep him occupied for several days, Jacob gathered his family, his servants, and all the vast flocks and wealth he had accumulated. He put his children and wives on camels and set off, crossing the Euphrates River and heading toward the hill country of Gilead, back toward the land of Canaan. But the departure was not without complication. In a fateful and foolish act, Rachel stole her father's household gods, small idols or teraphim that were believed to hold protective powers, and in some cases were linked to inheritance rights. This act of theft, perhaps born of a lingering pagan superstition or a desire to take something of value from the father who had wronged her, would add a dangerous element to their escape. 3 days later, Laban was informed of Jacob's flight. Consumed by rage, he gathered his kinsmen and pursued Jacob, a furious chase that lasted for 7 days. He finally caught up with them in the hill country of Gilead. Laban's intentions were likely violent, but God intervened once more to protect Jacob. The night before Laban reached the camp, God came to him in a dream and gave him a stern warning. Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. This divine restraining order saved Jacob's life. The confrontation the next morning was tense. Laban accused Jacob of deceit and of stealing his daughters away like captives of war. He then leveled his most serious charge. "Why did you steal my gods?" Jacob, unaware of Rachel's theft, was indignant. He proclaimed his innocence and made a rash vow, "If you find anyone with your gods, that person shall not live." A frantic search of the camp ensued, but when Laban came to Rachel's tent, she cleverly hid the idols in her camel's saddle and sat on them, feigning illness to avoid having to stand. The idols were not found. The confrontation ended with Jacob finally unleashing 20 years of pent-up frustration, recounting his faithful service and Laban's constant exploitation. A covenant of peace was made between them. They set up a pillar of stones as a witness, a boundary that neither would cross to harm the other. Laban kissed his grandchildren and daughters goodbye and returned home. Jacob was finally free, but a much greater fear now loomed on the horizon, the reunion with his brother, Esau. With the threat of Laban behind him, Jacob turned his face toward the promised land, but his path was overshadowed by a far more terrifying ghost from his past. The memory of Esau's bitter cry and his murderous vow had haunted Jacob for 2 decades. Now, the time of reckoning was at hand. The Bible says that Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. This brief but powerful encounter was a divine encouragement, a reminder of the heavenly protection he had seen at Bethel, steeling him for the trial to come. But even with this reassurance, Jacob's fear was palpable and all-consuming. His old nature, the one that relied on human strategy and planning, took over. He sent messengers ahead to the land of Seir, the country of Edom, with a carefully crafted message for Esau. The message was one of extreme humility and appeasement. He instructed his messengers to refer to Esau as "my lord," and to himself as "your servant Jacob." He detailed his long sojourn with Laban and the wealth he had acquired, not as a boast, but to show that he was not returning as a beggar seeking a portion of the inheritance he had stolen. He was a powerful man in his own right, hoping to find favor in your eyes. The messengers returned with news that struck terror into Jacob's heart. "We went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." 400 men. This was not a welcoming party, it was a small army. In Jacob's mind, this could only mean one thing. Esau had not forgotten, he had not forgiven, and he was coming to exact his long-awaited revenge. The Bible states that Jacob was in great fear and distress. His carefully constructed world, his large family, and his vast wealth all seemed on the brink of annihilation. His fear drove him back to his default mode, strategic planning. He divided his entire camp, his people, his flocks, his herds, and his camels into two groups. His logic was one of damage control. If Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. It was a pragmatic, yet desperate attempt to save at least a remnant of his family. But then, in the midst of his terror and frantic scheming, Jacob did something he had never truly done before. He turned to God in genuine, desperate, and humble prayer. He was no longer the arrogant schemer who used God's name to further his own lies. This was the prayer of a broken and terrified man. He began by reminding God of his identity and his past faithfulness. "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac." He then reminded God of his own command and promise. "You who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper.'" He confessed his own unworthiness, a profound statement of humility from a man once consumed by pride. "I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps." Finally, he laid his fear bare before the Lord. "Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children." He concluded by clinging to God's promise of countless descendants. This prayer marks a monumental shift in Jacob's spiritual journey. It was a prayer of total dependence. After praying, he returned to his plans, but they were now secondary to his appeal to God. He prepared a lavish gift for Esau, an enormous procession of animals, hundreds of goats, sheep, camels, cows, and donkeys, sent ahead in successive waves. Each servant was instructed to tell Esau that the animals were a gift from his servant Jacob, who was coming behind him. He hoped to pacify him with these gifts before they met face to face. He had done everything humanly possible. He had prayed, he had planned, he had sent gifts. Now all that was left was to wait for the dawn and for the brother whose life he had ruined. That night, on the banks of the Jabbok River, was the darkest and most transformative night of Jacob's life. He had sent his family, his possessions, and his gifts across the ford of the river, a final desperate act of placing a buffer between himself and the approaching danger. Now he was completely alone again, just as he had been at Bethel. But this was a different kind of solitude. It was not the loneliness of a fugitive, but the isolation of a man on the eve of his greatest trial, stripped of all his worldly defenses and forced to confront the fears within his own soul. The darkness of the night was a perfect mirror for the darkness of his uncertainty. It was in this state of raw vulnerability that a mysterious man appeared and began to wrestle with him. The struggle was not a brief scuffle. It was an all-night marathon, a relentless, grueling contest of will and endurance that lasted until the break of day. Who was this man? The text is deliberately mysterious. He is called a man, but Jacob later identifies him as God, and the prophet Hosea refers to him as an angel. This was no mere mortal. This was a divine encounter, a physical manifestation of Jacob's lifelong spiritual struggle. For his entire life, Jacob had been wrestling. He wrestled with his brother in the womb. He wrestled for the birthright. He wrestled for the blessing. He wrestled with Laban for his wages and his family. He had spent his life striving, scheming, and fighting in his own strength to get what he wanted. Now he was physically wrestling with the very source of all strength. As the dawn approached, his opponent, seeing that he could not overpower Jacob, reached out and touched the socket of Jacob's hip, wrenching it out of place. A searing, disabling pain shot through Jacob's body. He was crippled. The part of his body that represented his strength, his ability to run and to flee, was broken. He could no longer rely on his physical power, yet even in his brokenness, Jacob refused to let go. The man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob, clinging with every ounce of his remaining strength, gasped, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This was the cry of a changed man. The old Jacob would have tried to trick or steal the blessing. The new Jacob, broken and defeated, knew he could only receive it as a gift. He was no longer trying to seize control. He was desperately clinging to God, admitting that he could not go on without a divine touch on his life. The man asked him a simple, profound question. "What is your name?" It was a question that forced Jacob to confront his entire identity. To answer was to confess everything he was. "Jacob," he replied, "the supplanter, the deceiver, the schemer." It was a moment of complete and total self-revelation, an admission of his flawed nature before God. Then came the words of transformation. His opponent declared, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." The name change was monumental. He was no longer defined by his grasping, deceptive nature. His new name, Israel, meant he struggles with God. His very identity was now redefined by this sacred encounter. The struggle itself became his new name, his badge of honor. His greatest weakness had been transformed into his greatest strength. Jacob, ever inquisitive, asked for his opponent's name, but was simply told, "Why do you ask my name?" Then right there, he blessed him. As the sun rose over the horizon, Jacob limped away from that place, a physically broken but spiritually whole man. He called the place Peniel, meaning face of God, for he said, "I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." He would walk with a limp for the rest of his days, a permanent physical reminder of his weakness and his utter dependence on God. The limp was not a mark of shame, but a sacred scar, a testament to the night he wrestled with God and finally learned to surrender. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley, Jacob, now renamed Israel, looked up and saw a sight that would have once sent him into a paralyzing panic. There, in the distance, was Esau, and with him were his 400 men. The moment of truth had arrived, but this was not the same Jacob who had trembled with fear the night before. He was a changed man, limping and broken, but also blessed and resolute. He still took precautions, dividing his family. He put the maidservants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear, the most protected position. But his own actions were dramatically different. He, who had once fled in terror, now walked ahead of his entire family. He put himself in the front line, ready to face his brother's wrath first. As he approached Esau, he bowed down to the ground 7 times, an act of profound humility and respect in that culture. He was demonstrating through his actions that he was indeed Esau's servant, making no claim to the superiority the blessing had given him. He was a man humbled, not by fear, but by his encounter with God. The scene was fraught with tension. What would Esau do? Would he draw his sword? Would he command his men to attack? The 400 men stood as silent witnesses to a reunion 20 years in the making. But then, the unthinkable happened. The Bible says, "But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept." In that single moment, 2 decades of bitterness, anger, and fear melted away in a flood of tears. The expected confrontation dissolved into a tender, emotional reconciliation. Esau, the rugged hunter, the man who had been so deeply wronged, responded not with vengeance, but with grace. He saw his brother, not as the deceiver who had stolen his future, but as the twin with whom he had shared a womb. His heart was moved to compassion. He looked past the man who was bowing before him and saw the women and children. "Who are these with you?" he asked. Jacob replied, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." One by one, the family members came forward and bowed down before their uncle. Then Esau saw the droves of animals that had been sent ahead. "What do you mean by all these droves I met?" he asked. Jacob explained that they were a gift to find favor in his Lord's eyes. But Esau's response revealed the extent of his transformation as well. "I already have plenty, my brother," he said. "Keep what you have for yourself." He called Jacob my brother, not my enemy. He had no need for Jacob's wealth. He was a powerful and prosperous man in his own right. The gifts were no longer necessary to pacify him. Jacob, however, insisted, framing his plea in a way that showed the depth of his spiritual understanding. "For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably." He was connecting Esau's earthly forgiveness with the divine forgiveness he had experienced at Peniel. For him, seeing grace in his brother's eyes was a reflection of the grace he had received from God. Reluctantly, Esau accepted the gift. He offered to travel with Jacob or leave some of his men as an escort, but Jacob politely declined, understanding that their paths, though reconciled, were destined to be different. Esau returned to Seir, and Jacob and his family journeyed on, eventually settling near the city of Shechem. The feared apocalypse had become a beautiful reunion. It was a powerful testament to the fact that when God changes a person's heart, he can also change the hearts of those around them. The story of Jacob and Esau's reconciliation is a stunning picture of forgiveness, a reminder that the grace of God is powerful enough to heal the deepest wounds and restore what was broken. Returning to the Promised Land was not an entry into a life of ease and comfort. Jacob, now Israel, soon discovered that being God's chosen patriarch did not grant him immunity from profound sorrow and a new set of devastating trials. His family, born out of rivalry and dysfunction, carried its brokenness into the new land, and the consequences were tragic. The first major crisis occurred in Shechem, the very place where Abraham had first received the promise of the land. Jacob's only daughter Dinah went out to visit the women of the city. In a brutal act of violence, she was defiled by Shechem, the son of the city's ruler. What followed was a disaster of escalating sin. Shechem, claiming to love Dinah, asked for her hand in marriage, and his father proposed a peaceful alliance of intermarriage and trade between their peoples. Jacob remained silent, awaiting the return of his sons. But when Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, heard what had happened, they were consumed by a burning, furious rage. They saw the defilement of their sister as a deep stain on their family's honor. They responded with a deception that was chillingly reminiscent of their father's own past. They pretended to agree to the alliance, but with one condition, that all the men of Shechem be circumcised, the sign of the covenant. They used the most sacred symbol of their faith as a tool for their bloody revenge. The men of Shechem, eager for the alliance and the wealth of Jacob's family, agreed. Then, on the third day, when the men were at their most vulnerable and sore from the procedure, Simeon and Levi entered the city, swords in hand, and slaughtered every single male. They plundered the city, taking the women, children, and livestock, and rescued their sister Dinah. When Jacob heard what they had done, he was horrified, but his rebuke was rooted in fear, not righteousness. "You have brought trouble on me by making me a stench to the Canaanites," he cried. "We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." He was afraid of the consequences. Simeon and Levi's retort was sharp and telling. Should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? This event revealed the violent, vengeful hearts of Jacob's sons, a dark legacy that would continue to cause trouble. The family's journey was marked by further heartbreak. As they traveled from Shechem, God called Jacob back to Bethel, the place of his first encounter with the divine. There, he had his family purify themselves, burying their foreign gods under an oak tree, and God reaffirmed the covenant with him, repeating the promise of a great nation and the land. But soon after this spiritual high point, tragedy struck again. Rachel, the beloved wife for whom Jacob had labored for 14 years, went into a difficult labor. She gave birth to a second son, but the delivery cost her her life. With her dying breath, she named the boy Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow. But Jacob, perhaps unable to bear such a grim name, renamed him Benjamin, son of my right hand. Jacob buried the love of his life on the road to Bethlehem, setting up a pillar over her tomb, a monument to his deepest love and his greatest loss. The succession of trials was not over. Shortly after, his firstborn son, Reuben, committed a terrible sin, sleeping with his father's concubine, Bilhah, an act that defiled his father's bed and cost him the rights of the firstborn forever. And then came the most devastating blow of all, the loss of his favorite son, Joseph, Rachel's firstborn. Consumed by jealousy, his other sons sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt and then deceived their aging father, presenting him with Joseph's ornate robe, dipped in goat's blood, as proof that he had been killed by a wild animal. Jacob was utterly shattered. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son for many days, refusing to be comforted. "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave," he wept. The deceiver was now the victim of a terrible deception, experiencing the same anguish he had once inflicted upon his own father. The promised land had become a place of deep, gut-wrenching sorrow, testing Jacob's new identity as Israel to its very core. The final chapter of Jacob's long and tumultuous life is a testament to the magnificent, overarching sovereignty of God, who weaves even the most painful threads of human sin and suffering into a beautiful tapestry of redemption. For many years, Jacob lived under the heavy cloak of grief, believing his beloved son Joseph was dead. He presided over a fractured and guilty family, his remaining sons secretly carrying the weight of their horrific betrayal. But a severe famine fell upon the land, a famine so devastating it forced Jacob to send his sons to the one place that had grain, Egypt. He had no idea that this journey, born of desperation, was actually a divine appointment. He had no clue that the powerful Egyptian vizier who controlled the world's food supply was none other than the son he had mourned for dead. What followed was a dramatic and emotional series of events where Joseph, unrecognized by his brothers, tested their hearts to see if they had changed. He saw their remorse, their willingness to sacrifice for their youngest brother, Benjamin, and finally he could bear the secret no longer. He revealed himself in one of the most poignant scenes in all of Scripture, crying out, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" The brothers were terrified, but Joseph offered them not revenge, but a breathtaking perspective on God's providence. "Do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was not you who sent me here, but God." When the news reached Jacob that Joseph was alive and was the ruler of Egypt, his spirit, which had been numb with grief for so long, revived. The Lord encouraged him in a vision, "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you up again." So Jacob, now a very old man, gathered his entire household, 70 souls in all, and made the journey to Egypt. The reunion between the aged father and the long-lost son is incredibly moving. They embraced and wept for a long time. Jacob, holding his son, said, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." His life had come full circle. He was brought before Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler on earth. And Jacob, the humble shepherd, the man who had started life as a fugitive, now stood as a patriarch, a prince with God, and he blessed Pharaoh. His final years were spent in peace and prosperity in the land of Goshen. As his death approached, he called his sons to his bedside to bestow his final blessing. But this was not like the blessing he had stolen from his father. This was a series of prophetic pronouncements, discerning the character and destiny of each of his sons and the tribes that would descend from them. He gave the preeminent blessing not to the firstborn Reuben, who had disqualified himself, nor to Simeon and Levi for their violence, but to Judah, prophesying that the scepter will not depart from Judah until he to whom it belongs shall come. This was the prophetic line of the kings and ultimately the Messiah. He also adopted Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own, and in a final symbolic act, he deliberately crossed his hands, placing his right hand on the head of the younger son, Ephraim, giving him the greater blessing, a final echo of the divine principle that had governed his entire life. The older will serve the younger. His last command was not to be buried in the grandeur of Egypt, but to be carried back to the promised land and buried in the cave of Machpelah with his fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and his wife Leah. He died a man at peace, his journey complete. He began his life grasping his brother's heel, a supplanter. He lived it as a schemer, a fugitive, a servant, and a mourner. But he ended it as Israel, a prince who had striven with God and prevailed, the father of a great nation, a patriarch whose faith looked forward to the promise that was to come. His life is the ultimate story of transformation, a powerful reminder that God does not choose us because we are perfect, but He perfects us through a lifelong journey of wrestling, breaking, and finally surrendering to His incredible grace.